All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We're looking at Chapter 16, Section 1, Global Maritime Expansion before 1450. So specifically, let's go ahead and clear this up. Global, pretty straightforward, talking about the world. Maritime, this usually means overseas. Expansion, of course, pretty self-explanatory, before 1450. So around the globe, what did overseas exploration look like prior to 1450? And the reason why 1450 is significant is because, and it's loosely tied to the year 1492, which is the voyage of Christopher Columbus. And what Christopher Columbus did, of course, was to quote-unquote discover the New World, right? And so simply this chapter is kind of looking at how did other civilizations around the world explore and expand overseas before this monumental event, which of course would go on to dramatically change and dramatically alter world history. We're going to look at the various geographical areas, that is, how do people explore various oceans, beginning with the Indian Ocean. If you're not entirely familiar with the geographic location of the Indian Ocean, we'll go down to this map here. The Indian Ocean is this body of water right here. So anything kind of going on in this area is more or less what we're referring to. Now, the Indian Ocean up until 1450 was probably the most traveled sea network or maritime network in the world. It was one of the few areas in which people prior to 1450 could do what they called deep water sailing or blue water sailing. That is to sail beyond just simply where you could see the land. Navigation technology before 1450 wasn't all that great. You more or less had to rely on things like astrological signs in order to know where one was going in something like a vast ocean. But one of the reasons why the Indian Ocean was so well traveled was because of the monsoon winds. And these were seasonal and predictable. So people in the Indian Ocean could count on the winds blowing a certain direction during the summer and fall months, and then during the winter and spring months it would blow the other direction. And because it was predictable, one could at least have a little bit more reassurance having traveled over open water, right? So the monsoon winds for one season, for example, may have blown this way, and then the other season may have blown this way, and this happened every single season. So people had been traveling, or at least expanding and exploring the Indian Ocean for a very long time, 1,000 years before 1450. There's a huge increase in maritime activity in the Indian Ocean with the introduction of Islam. Islam comes around or hits the scene, anywhere between 600 CE in the Arabian Peninsula, but really expands all the way into this area, all the way into the year 1000. So even 500 or 400 years before Christopher Columbus, Muslim merchants were traveling all around the Indian Ocean and establishing various economic and religious contacts. So much so that Islam as a religion was spread to places like Indonesia, which today, Indonesia are these islands located kind of in this area. Islam was spread to that area via trade routes, in the 1000 CE around that time period. And today Indonesia is a predominantly Islamic nation, and that goes all the way back to this particular time period. However, right on the eve of 1450, it wasn't necessarily Muslim merchants per se, but rather the Ming dynasty, which was the most powerful force in the Indian Ocean, or at least potentially the most powerful force in the Indian Ocean. The Ming dynasty was a Chinese empire, right? Empire that ruled from roughly about, we'll say, 1380-ish CE till about 1640 CE. That's where the Ming dynasty ruled. And again, this was a dynasty that was located in China, right? So it was right here. And in the early 1400s, the Ming dynasty organized and carried out what was the most expensive and largest expedition of ships to explore and sail around the Indian Ocean that the world had ever seen. The Chinese ships that were built by the Ming Dynasty were called junks or yunks. So a junk is a Chinese treasure ship. And you can see a Chinese yunk or junk right here, right? That's an illustration of how big that is. This illustration also showing you a Portuguese ship just for comparison. So these were massive ships. Again, the largest ships that the world had ever seen. The Ming Dynasty employed Zheng He, who was a Chinese Muslim. Again, it was important that he was a Muslim because there had already been established Islamic trading networks here for a very, very long time. So being familiar with the culture, familiar with the religious practice, that could definitely benefit China. So that was part of the reasons why Zheng He was chosen, because there was a common cultural background there. Chinese Muslim, we'll call him Maritime. We'll call him Navigator. Right, that's what we called him. But he was placed in charge of this massive fleet, and more or less what the Ming Dynasty wanted to do was, via Zheng He, establish diplomatic relations, look possibly if there were any type of economic benefits that could be extracted, trading networks, whatever it is. In fact, these blue lines here show you all the different voyages that Zheng He took, right? So this was all the voyages of Zheng He, and these voyages took place from roughly 1410 till about 1430, right? So establishing places like the Swahili city-states. Swahili is actually a language, so I'll write language. It is a mixture of African and Arabic languages. And so one of the areas that Zheng He and the Ming Dynasty traveled to was this eastern coast of Africa, right? These would be where the Swahili kingdoms were established. It turns out that Zheng He and the Ming Dynasty really didn't find all that much there. There wasn't a lot of valuable trade. There were some novelty trade items, so like a giraffe, for example, came from Africa, but nothing really of value. And beginning in 1430, the Ming Dynasty decided that overseas exploration was not the answer, that it was not worth the investment. And so the Ming Dynasty retreated after 1430. Some reasons include, again, there wasn't a lot of money to be made by these voyages. It was very expensive to build these ships, and if it doesn't turn a profit, then, well, why bother doing it? You also had various internal issues in the Ming Dynasty. The Mongol threat, for example. The Mongols were people who resided or lived in northern China, who the Chinese had a very long and strained history with. So would the Mongols come and attack? It's not a good idea to perhaps spend all of one's money on navigation and ships when you're facing a potential threat at home. So the Ming Dynasty retreated, and after 1430, there was really no centralized power that had control of the Indian Ocean, essentially leaving a vacuum for later on Portuguese explorers to come and fill. In the Pacific Ocean, a little bit less traveled, but not completely empty. So the Pacific Ocean is this body of water right here. Now, overseas or maritime expansion in the Pacific Ocean before 1450 was done primarily by Polynesian people. Polynesia is what is indicated in the green here, essentially. It is the name for the people who inhabit these various islands here. So, for example, places like Hawaii, Samoa, Tonga, right? These all fall under the umbrella of Polynesian or Polynesia people, culture, language, etc. And these various explorations took place anywhere between, and you can kind of get an indication of some of these dates here, but a little bit more recent. So anywhere from about 800 CE till about 1400 CE. And these migrations were a lot less common than what you had than what was occurring in the Indian Ocean. There is evidence that Polynesian culture did reach South America. We have things like plants and animals that tell us that there was at least one, perhaps more, migrations from these islands to South America. Let's get a good color. Right, so maybe from one of these islands, South America, you can't see right here, which also kind of, it sort of bursts this myth, or it counteracts this myth that Christopher Columbus was the first person from the Old World to the New. That is not, in fact, the case. The ships that Polynesians used were canoes. Now, they didn't utilize sailing technology, but they could be very large, 120 feet long, which would allow entire societies to move. And one of the reasons why Polynesian people were able to successfully settle many of the islands in the Pacific Ocean was because these canoes and these expeditions carried both men and women. So even though we can say that the people inhabiting Hawaii, New Zealand, Tahiti, Samoa, Fiji, they fall under this umbrella of Polynesian culture, there is also very distinct cultures and distinct languages depending on which one of the islands is being focused on. And this gives rise to the various unique societies there. Again, comparatively, we would say that overseas exploration in the Pacific Ocean was much less, was more rare than perhaps something going on in the Indian Ocean. Lastly, let's look at the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is this body of water right here. Some notable overseas or maritime expansion there included the Vikings, which came from Denmark. Denmark, Norway, Sweden. You know, these are sort of the areas that we're talking about. This is Europe, or falls under the umbrella of Europe. And the Vikings traveled to, islands like Greenland, Iceland. They, of course, traveled all over Europe during the Middle Ages. Viking explorations really range anywhere from 800 CE till about, we'll say, maybe around the 1200 CE. So 400 years the Vikings were very much active. And a very important Viking settlement to take note of was that of Vinland, which was established in eastern Canada. And while we do have perhaps biological, evidence, various plants and animals, that Polynesian peoples arrived in the Americas, we also have archaeological evidence from the Vikings, so we know concretely, and specifically what time, the Vikings had established Vinland, which was approximately, we'll just say approximately 1000 CE, somewhere around there. Leif Erikson was the Viking responsible, so person responsible, for the Vinland colony. The Vinland colony was eventually abandoned by the Vikings. The Vikings themselves were interested in trading and raiding, stealing, plundering. In eastern Canada, there wasn't a lot there to trade with. There wasn't a lot there to raid with. And so that settlement, Vinland in eastern Canada, was abandoned. There are also other potential Atlantic Ocean overseas exploration. Mansa Musa, who was an African emperor of the Mali Empire, which is approximately 1300 CE, maybe around 1200 to 1300. Evidence that he sent out, the Mali Empire sent out voyages into the Atlantic Ocean, although it's inconclusive as to whether or not they actually reached the New World. And then, of course, on the side of the New World, you do have overseas, or at least maritime expansion by Native Americans. The Amerindians, this is simply just another term for either American Indian. You may also just use the term Indian or Native American, right? So these are all terms used to describe the same group of people. It's essentially the people who inhabited the New World before 1492, and specifically the group the Arawak, right, which is a specific group who explored or traveled and inhabited the Caribbean islands, right? So the Caribbean islands. And you can see that illustrated on the map here with these various movements occupying modern-day Haiti, modern-day Cuba, modern-day Jamaica, etc., etc.